Hello, everybody. It's 8 o'clock. It's time for this month's Adventurous Ink conversation. So thank you for joining us. This month, I'm sorry, we're not going to be chatting with James Rebanks, who's far too busy writing his next book, which is a great shame. But that's why I wanted to invite everyone to join us this evening with Annabel Abbs to discuss this month's deep read, which is Windswept, which is a fabulous book. I mean, I loved it the moment I started reading it, because I always like finding out about new people and how they engage with the outdoors. But I think this is a particularly interesting book because most of these stories and most of these people, we weren't aware of their connection with the natural world, and yet that connection turns out to have driven some, absolutely world-leading creativity, and it's thanks to Annabel that we get to discover that. So that's what we're going to be talking about this evening. I'm just going to bring Annabel in. There we go. Good evening, Annabel. Thank you so much for joining us.
No, thank you very much for having me here.
It's absolutely our pleasure. Where are you joining us from?
Well, I'm joining you from the remote wilderness of London. which is rather nice to be sitting in the middle of London, talking about the wild, adventurous hikes in remote places of these adventurous women. So
well, you need it all the more, don't you? When you're stuck in the heart of the metropolis.
Yes, indeed.
It's always right. But you didn't always live there, did you? So where did you grow up? It was in the wilds of Wales, I believe.
Yes, in the wilds of Wales, and in quite a remote part of Wales. So if anyone knows Wales, we lived right in the middle, on the very edge, so on the coastline, in what was known then as sort of Welsh Wales, because everyone still spoke Welsh, as in people spoke Welsh all the time. The school I went to, the lessons were in Welsh. I'm not sure if that's still the case. It might be, but certainly back in the early 70s, it was darkest, most Welshest of Wales. And there was very, very little public transport. I think there was a bus that came occasionally and took us to the nearest towns, and we were in a tiny little village.
But you would have known all about the lack of public transport, also lacking a car.
Yes. So we were very dependent on public transport. And in fact, one of my earliest memories in Wales is of going on a march. My parents are very keen demonstrators, and we went and protested because there were no buses. And then we got a bus, and then we went out and protested again, walked up and down. There were only maybe 20 of us in the village. We walked up and down the road protesting because there was no bus shelter. So if we wanted to wait for the bus, we would have to stand in the pouring rain. And that part of Wales, it's always raining. So there was a lot of waiting around in the rain and a lot of sort of marching and protesting to get things like bus shelters.
and a lot of walking, I guess. Which must have led to. Was it that led to a lifelong love of it, or did you fall out of love with walking for a while because you've been forced to do it so much?
Yes, definitely. I fell out of love, as I think probably all teenagers do. It's part of breaking that umbilical cord, isn't it? You have to fall out of love with the things that you've been sort of raised to believe in. It's really important part of the rebellion process, isn't it? Finding your voice. So I did fall out of love with walking, and I learned to drive and got myself a little car and all that sort of stuff. But then I missed walking. I missed walking so viscerally that I had to go back to it. It was sort of I realized it was somewhere in my genes. Although I think it's in most of our sort of genetic makeup, isn't it? Because we were designed to walk. But I guess it was just, it'd been nurtured in me, but not really so much as a thing of pleasure, more as a thing that was integral to living. So we walked because we had to. It wasn't sort of, now I'm much more like, oh, I'm going to go for a walk because I need the fresh air, I need the exercise, I want some creative ideas. Back then it was just, if you want to go to school, you walk. And of course we didn't go to school, so that didn't last very long. But if you wanted to go and see a friend, you walked. If you wanted to go to the shop, you walked. Anything at all, you walked. So it was a life lived on foot, really. I guess much as our ancestors lived before the car came along.
We shall come back to that, because there was some really fascinating stuff in the book about the physicality of walking, and I definitely want to go into that. But we can't leave your childhood without talking about well, you being an experiment, as you share in the book, in the way of bringing up children according to the principles of Rousseau. Now, how on earth did this come about, and how did it manifest?
Well, so as a young man, my father became very obsessed with Rousseau. So my father, he had me when he was very, very young. I was born when he was 21, still at university, and the first of his entire family ever to go to university. So he came from a very, very working class background, no books in the house other than a Bible. They were very religious. And he had somehow broken away from that and got himself to university, and was sort of, wanted to be a poet and wanted to be a philosopher. So he was quite an unusual man. And so we were all raised according to various philosophers. So Rousseau was mine. He was my guardian angel, really. So I didn't know this until, as I relay in the book, I must have been about 10 when he suddenly said to me, "You're an experiment." And to be told that as an adult is one thing, to be told that as a child was a bit like, oh, I didn't really know what it meant. And only much later did I start to understand what that had meant. And then in my 30s, really, I started reading Rousseau to try and understand, this had this experiment worked or not. And that is when one of the sort of periods in which I started to become a little bit cross, because I also found out, in fact, my father told me about Rousseau's partner. So I quickly changed direction, and I lost all interest in Rousseau, and became much more interested in this effectively a servant girl that he had lived with all his life, and refused to marry until the very end, and with whom he had these 5 children. And so at that stage, I started thinking about the life that Rousseau had and all these ideas he had for how children should be raised, and how he should be allowed to walk freely, and the life that his partner had. And she was not even allowed to keep any of their 5 children they had together. She was not allowed to keep any of them, and she worked all the time, in this sort of hotel as a servant girl, and doing laundry and helping in the kitchen. So I just looked at the juxtaposition of her life and Rousseau's life. And of course, at the same time, I was sort of thinking about my mother and my father, and the life that he had as a poet, and the freedom that brought, and the life that my mother had, which was very much about, sort of washing and feeding the children and doing the laundry and the gardening, because we were living this sort of off the land, sort of rural little idyll. But actually she was planting the vegetables and feeding the chickens and all of that good stuff while he was writing his poetry. So that's a very long answer to the sort of juxtapositions that I was starting to think about back then, and then just sort of festered.
It might be a very long answer, but it's a brilliant answer, and I think it leads us into an understanding of why you wanted to write a book like this. Do you think that did that spark off I guess an anger in you that you've continued to cultivate? Do you think that's what you're doing with your books?
I think so. A frustration, a curiosity. And an anger, I think, though anger's quite strong. But and then what happened was, when I came back to walking after my little break, and I got myself a little Fiat and drove around for a few years, and then when I came back to walking, I started doing long distance hikes again with the man who's now my husband, and then of course I had 4 children, fairly quickly. And in that period, my life just concertinaed right in. And you know, it's like you've got young children. Suddenly, I gave up my job, which had been, you know, which I'd loved, and I'd always been traveling. And suddenly I was just in a kitchen, with these four lovely children. And that's when I couldn't walk, and I started to live vicariously through the walkings of, well, what I didn't think about it. I just thought I want to read. I can't go out for long walks. I'm going to read about walking. So I started reading all the obvious things. You froze again, Tim.
Sorry.
That's okay. I don't know whether I should just sort of carry on talking to a frozen face. I should stop.
Everyone else hasn't frozen. It's only me. I'm only the host. What do I count? It's probably a good time to say, if anyone else has got any questions, feel free to chip in. Genuinely, I mean, if I disappear, feel free to take over the evening. I mean, but this is as much our conversation as it is for me to host. So do chip in.
Oh, yes, thank you, Gemma. Yes, I should just carry on. I could do a reading. I know Tim's back.
Sorry.
I did read Patrick Leaf more as well. Sorry, Tim. Actually, I just carry on because people are popping up with
brilliant, yeah,
interesting points. And you froze for quite a long time. So Patrick Leaf Moore, he was definitely on my list. Robert Louis Stevenson, Travels with My Donkey. There are just so many, and you know, in fairness, they're wonderful, wonderful accounts. And I sort of was living vicariously until one day I suddenly thought, I noticed that there's something about all these accounts of wonderful walks, and I noticed that they weren't really speaking to me I was just sort of living vicariously. They weren't making me want to go out and walk. They were just making me think, well, that's what it's like if you're a guy going for a wonderful walk. How nice. And then I just stopped and thought, but if I did that walk, I would have such a completely different experience of it. So at this stage, when I realized that I wasn't really getting the right, I suppose the right response from these accounts, I started thinking, well, I'll read some books by women who've been for a walk, and I couldn't find any. So this would have been about 2 decades ago, and there really was nothing at all. And then later on, I started to look out for old accounts, and I joined the London Library, and there they have an amazing selection of very, very old travel books, and there you can go and browse, which is very different from, you know, the British Library, or even, you know, when you go shopping online, you need to know what you're looking for. And I didn't. I just knew that I wanted to find accounts of women who had walked. So on the shelves of the London Library, I started to find very old travel books written by women in the 19th century and the early 20th century, and accounts of women walking, you know, all over the place. And then I started looking into letters and journals, diaries, and finding people like Simone de Beauvoir and Georgia O'Keeffe, that, you know, names everybody knows of, but no one knows them as walkers. So that was the second part of my research, really, was to move on and to go in through different angles, to reading people's letters, reading people's private journals. And then quite often I would find, you know, little references to, I walked, you know, I walked 30 kilometers. But Simone de Beauvoir, her accounts of her walking, they're really easy to find. I was sort of, when I did come across them, I mean, her memoirs are full of them. I was completely staggered that none of the men that wrote about walking, particularly the men that put together anthologies and things, I couldn't understand why they had never included her. And then in 2014, there was a book that came out by Frédéric Gros. He's a French professor of philosophy, and I thought, God, this is going to be wonderful. And I bought a copy for my father. And then before I gave it to him, I sort of, you know, read it as we do. And I was shocked that in amongst these, I had about 20 men in it, and all the usual Nietzsche, Rousseau, Wordsworth, you know, all the famous male walkers. There was not a single woman, and there was not even Simone de Beauvoir. I could not believe how a French philosopher, professor of philosophy, could have missed out the greatest female philosopher ever produced by France. So really, really made me cross. And I think that was probably the tipping point when I went to my agent and said, right, that's it. I'm going to write a book about walking and women walking. And she said, yeah, sure. But it took me quite a few years to pull all these various women together. In the end, I had about 50 women, and they were all crushed in. And when it went off to its first read by my editor, she said, you've got too many women in here, you've got to strip it right back. She said, just pick 6 or 7 women who people will know, or who really, really spoke to you most powerfully. So all the women who had written sort of travel guides and Victorian walking guides and things, they all got pulled out, and I focused on the women who are in there now. So that was sort of how it ended up in the shape that it is. But when I drilled down into the stories behind the women, the other thing I found was that women walk very differently. They walk for very different reasons. They walk differently from men, and they walk with this sort of added layer of complexity. But they also walk for very different reasons. So while you've got people like Paddy Leafham, or just putting on his knapsack and off he goes across Europe for adventure, really, and because he's bored and he's restless, and Robert Louis Stevenson, they're all the same. They've sort of got this adventurous spirit, haven't they? And they just want to go and sort of have new experiences. But for these women, it was very different. They weren't going for new experiences. They were going, it appeared, they were going to escape from what was at home. And sometimes that was someone at home. Quite often it was a person. Sometimes it was a sort of a future that they didn't want. So they were walking away from something in a very different way to all of the men who were writing about walking. So it seemed to be much more emotionally driven, if that makes sense. There was something they had to get away from. Whereas with the men, it was more as though they were walking towards something. Of course, everyone is walking towards something as much as they're walking away from something, but the men were walking away from something a bit different, less oppressive, was my take on it.
And it strikes me that it was such a bigger thing for the women in the book to be finding themselves out there. In that it was sort of pushing against societal norms, really, wasn't it?
Yes, and I think I hadn't realized quite how, particularly the further back you went to the Victorian women, how much doing something like that was a risk to not only their reputation, but the reputation of their entire family. So some of the earlier walkers who did get missed out, their families would say to them, you just can't do that. You just cannot go on a walking tour in the Alps on your own. It's just not done. So by the time you get into the 20th century and you get to the sort of Georgia O'Keeffe and Simone de Beauvoir, some of that has sort of faded away, but there was still enormous pressure on them to stay at home and to either look after elderly, unwell parents, or to look after husbands, look after children. So the pressure was still there, but we've already got the start of the suffragettes have done quite a bit of work in the meantime. So that stain on your character and your family's character is much less for those women, but they're still taking a huge risk.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's hard for us to understand, isn't it, really, in these current times, how difficult that must have been, even though women have still got, as you say, very different reasons and challenges to getting out into the great outdoors. It's so hard to put ourselves into the context of the time. I think the person that I found that most with actually was with Nan Shepherd, someone who we've come across before. We've read Little Mountain, and you think you know someone, but what the book really opened up was the context in which they were getting out there, and just the gulf between the expectations of the role that they were meant to be fulfilling and the way that they felt they needed to live their lives outdoors.
Yes, and I think what's happened between this, the Victorian, so the first phase of women walkers, are about 1850 to about 1900. So I come in with Gwen John in 1903, but there's an earlier phase, what I call the Victorian sort of lady walkers, if you like, who did get cut out. They are walking, and they are the ones who are walking in the long skirts and the corsets and whatever. I've completely forgotten what I was going to say about the Victorian walkers who got chopped out. I've just got right out of my head what I was going to say about them. But there's quite a difference between them and then the earlier 20th century walkers, who are walking with a sort of a new layer of liberty that their predecessors didn't have. But their predecessors had opened the way for them, so they weren't quite as pioneering. The real pioneers are women walking in 1850s and the 1860s.
So is that
people like Mathilde Blind and Mary Eyre, that no one will know any of the names. So a lot of those women then would go off and they'd write a little guidebook. My walks in the Dolomites, my walks in the Alps, my tour of the French Alps, whatever. And this book would often be printed once, very small print run, and then that was it. It would never be reprinted. So these were the books that I found, right at the back of the London Library, right in the basement. Sort of, I don't think anyone's taken them out for years and years, but I was able to take them out and take them home and read them. And they were just regular women, but often they would put some of their backstory in. If you read the whole book, there'd be a little bit of backstory, and they are getting away from, either they've had to nurse an elderly mother for maybe 2 decades, and the mother dies, and then off they go. Or their husband has died and their children are grown up, and suddenly then they will just go off. So they're that first generation of walking women, really, who do write about it. But then the ones that come after that don't really write about it until when Nan Shepherd then writes about it. And of course, she can't find a publisher for 30 years. So there's a huge 50 odd years when none of them, they go walking and none of them write accounts of it. And that's where I had to find it, in the letters and the memoirs. So someone like Georgia O'Keeffe wrote thousands and thousands of letters. And all the way through her letters are these endless references to these walks that she takes, walks at night, walks in the wind, long walks carrying easels and paints, walks where she then pitches a tent. But although there are many biographies of Georgia O'Keeffe, to date, everyone has really been interested in her and Stieglitz, just in the same way that everyone's been interested in Simone de Beauvoir and Sartre. And Simone and Sartre didn't walk together, so that's got missed out. And Georgia O'Keeffe and Stieglitz never walked together, so people tended to focus on her relationship with Stieglitz, or her her art and how, the exhibitions, and they haven't really been particularly interested in her walking. So it was all there. It only took someone that was a slightly obsessive walker to come through and just pick out all the walking bits, and then wow.
I'm so glad there's a lot of interest in the chat in all the other 45 who didn't make the cut. We do normally make it a rule that we don't talk about next books, but is there another book in the offing? Do you think there's still some stories to be told?
Well, what happened with the 45 women? Okay, well, maybe 50 in total, and then I've ended up with about 8, haven't I? So maybe 42 went. So first of all, I put them into. So first of all, when my British editor said there's too many, cut them out, I put them in an appendix, because any of you who writes knows that when you found something like this, and you just think it's fantastic and you don't want to ever lose it, you don't want to kill your darlings at all. So I put them in this giant appendix. And then my American editor said, oh, no, we can't have this. It just ruins it, having this great big appendix stuck on the end. So the appendix went. So then what I do, I said, now once a week, I put one on social. I put one on my Instagram account with a bit about them and a quote. And that's probably all it will be. But I'm very much hoping that one day someone will do a huge, an anthology of women walkers, because there are so many of them and they are still largely unknown. So that book is available.
Well,
For anyone who wants to take it on.
Still plenty to go at there. But I love that you trawled through all of these documents. There was a line from Georgia O'Keeffe, and it said that she was growing tall and straight inside. And I thought that was wonderful. And you even in the book, you said that line had stuck with you. And I think it stuck with me afterwards. And I keep seeing really tall, straight pine trees and thinking, I wonder if that was what sparked that idea within it. But there's definitely something about the outdoors and the freedom that it allows to think and be yourself, really, I guess. Do you think is that what they were trying to cultivate?
I think with probably all of the women, most of the women walkers, no, probably all of them, they were very caught up with a very what I call a large male. So going on, it was Rodin, with Simone de Beauvoir, it was Sartre, with Georgia O'Keeffe, it was Stieglitz, with Frida Lawrence, it was D.H. Lawrence. So they were all sort of in the shadow of someone who had partially made them. So it's a very complicated relationship. So they felt these, I think, quite deep loyalties to these men who had in many ways furthered their career. And in many ways, Stieglitz, he'd given Georgia O'Keeffe this great platform in his gallery, and he had really promoted her and nurtured her career, not always in a way that was particularly beneficial for her, but they were all caught up in quite complicated relationships, from which it was quite hard for them to extricate themselves. So one of the ways they did extricate themselves was literally by physically lifting themselves out, so taking them bodily away from the man who was really sort of steering them. And I think Simone de Beauvoir she alludes to this, that she needed to learn, she needed to find her own voice, she needed to learn to think for herself away from this very, very large presence of Sartre. And although, of course, she was widely agreed to have been the brightest student in that year, more intelligent than Sartre, she was very much under his, living in his shadow for quite a long time. And the other thing about these, most of these men, not all of them, but certainly Rodin, Stieglitz, and Sartre, is they were just serially unfaithful. So these women are having to deal not only with living in the career shadow, if you like, of the men that they were bound up with, but also having to deal emotionally with that burden of jealousy, and trying to work out how they maintain their self-respect, their self-esteem, how they find a place for them in that relationship, because none of them walked away from their partners or those men. And Simone de Beauvoir was, lifelong friends with Sartre. She never left him. And even Georgia O'Keeffe and Stieglitz, she stayed with him, albeit she spent half the year in New Mexico. She stayed with him until he died. So they had those old-fashioned notions of loyalty, which I think made it even more imperative for them to go for these very long walks, where they had that time and space just entirely to themselves. And I thought it was quite interesting how many of them chose to walk alone, and how much they needed that time, particularly Gwen John, but particularly Simone de Beauvoir, and particularly Georgia O'Keeffe, that they needed to be on their own. So sometimes they would go with a friend or a sister or whatever, but often they needed to be with no one around them in really remote places. And the other thing I kept having to remind myself when I went off, in their tracks, was that they did not have waterproof trousers. They did not have mobile phones. They did not have GPS. They did not have lightweight rucksacks. So when they went, it was physically more demanding, and it was much more intimidating. I can just whip out my phone if I need something. And I always had somewhere to sleep, or I booked myself a place, or go somewhere where there's a campsite. They were just having to sleep rough quite often, or they would arrive in a village, and they'd have to go around knocking on doors, because there was no Airbnb, there were no B&Bs. You knocked on a door and asked for a bed. Now that is something that just would not be acceptable to us now, would it? I wouldn't let any of my teenage daughters, or go off and arrive somewhere where they just knocked on doors. So that the level of risk they took was something that I don't think we would take, and that I kept having to remind myself of.
But you did recreate or follow in the footsteps of many of the women that you wrote about, and it seemed to me that you found what they found as well. Did you set out looking for that, or do you think that was just a natural part of the process of walking and being alone in the outdoors?
I think that, and I think it's exactly the same for these women. I don't think I realized until quite late on in the process what I was doing in my own mind. So I had really told myself I was writing a book about walking, and then one day I thought, I'm walking away from my own life. I'm walking away from a part of my life that is leaving me, and I'm trying to come to terms with that. And it was just like a coup de foudre. It was a bolt of lightning, and I thought, oh my God, this is why I'm writing this book. And I think I suspect many of those women went through a similar process, as in they didn't know why they were walking. I don't think Simone de Beauvoir, and in fact she says, I go for a walk, I don't think about anything, I'm just happily looking at the flowers. That is so not true, Simone. That is just not what she was doing. But we don't always know why we're doing what we're doing, do we? So it did take me a while, but once I had realized what I was walking away from and walking towards too, that enabled me, I think, to have another layer of understanding into why these particular women, what they were walking away from, and why, and how the walking works, how it does enable you. There's something about when you move, I always think of it as being a bit like a sifting flour or a coffee filter or something. You're sifting your flour in the sieve, and all the fine stuff comes out, and then the coarse bits get left in the sieve, don't they? So walking is the same. You're moving along, and things are sort of just filtering down, and you're discarding things as you go along, and you're not really aware of that until you finish. And I think that's particularly so when you're walking day after day after day, in the manner of some of those women. So the really long walks, it's sort of like a pilgrimage, really. Rather than the stroll around the park where you just clear your head and then you go home again.
There was bits in the book. I mean, obviously we read a lot about walking in the outdoors, but there were still bits in the book that were new, certainly to me. So you talk about the physicality and what do you say? The foot to ground impact of walking sends pressure waves surging through the arteries, dramatically increasing blood to the brain. Now, I didn't know about that physical part of the process. So it was fascinating. But I wondered, and I was wondering this as I was reading the book, which side you fell on in terms of thinking about the physicality of it, or the more cultural and spiritual significance. And then I got to the bit where you actually discussed that, and you talked about Lawrence's fulminating and raging at our scientific attempts to understand it and make it as boring and dogmatic as religion. I thought that was fascinating. Which side do you fall on then? Do you like understanding the way it works, or do you like to be in the magic of it?
There's a funny story here. Funny story. So when another thing that happened after I'd written it, it had much more science in. So there was much more about, the footfall and the oxygen to the brain and whatever. And again, my editor said, she said, what, Annabel, it's just not working. It doesn't really work. You've got the spiritual and you've got the scientific. And she said, I think you should strip out all the science. So I stripped out quite a lot of it. And then in the pandemic, I was sitting there with this great big pile of science that had come out of Windswept. And I went to my agent. I said, I think I've got another book here. I've got a more sciencey book. And And oh yeah, and it came out about a month ago, which so I had to publish it under my maiden name. That's right, under my married name. So Windswept's my maiden name, Abbs, and this I had to publish under my married name, Streets, because my editor was concerned that I'd have 2 books on walking out at the same time. So I do have 2 books on walking out at the same time. They're slightly different. And so this one, a lot of the science went into 52 Ways to Walk, which looks at, you know, what happens when we walk in the darkness, what happens when we walk in the wind, what happens when we walk in the rain. Because one of the things I discovered while I was researching Windswept is that we change, you know, we're slightly different physiologically. We're different when we're walking in sunshine, we're different when we're walking in darkness, you know, just different things come to the fore. So, which I found fascinating, but my editor thought it was all just too much, you know, there was just too many women, too much of everything thrown in. So a lot of it got pared right back. So for anyone writing, never throw out your offcuts, because sometimes the offcuts can be another book.
It's funny how often we hear from our authors about the relationship that they have with their editor, but I don't think we've ever heard quite such a clear sifting and here's what came out of it as well. That's absolutely fabulous. What a great way to get it out there. So I mean, you talked about walking in the darkness there, and there was a bit where you shared in the book about the walk that you did that scared you, and went back and you found out what had happened in that place. For those who've not read it, can you tell us the story of what happened there, and then I want to ask a couple of questions about it.
Yeah, so that's when I was staying in down in France, near where Simone de Beauvoir had done her first 5 years of walking, really, which was around Marseille. So I was sort of down there, and I was doing a writer's residency, and there was this beautiful walk that was in the Vaucluse, which is where Simone de Beauvoir had walked. Now, Simone de Beauvoir was absolutely fearless. She had very, very little, but she very rarely felt frightened. I, however, am a complete wuss, and I feel frightened all the time, which is one of the things I really wanted to I wanted to walk through that. So there was a forest, and one day I did this beautiful walk through this forest, and I came to a part of the forest. I sort of went into the forest, and it was a very, very strange feeling. And you know, there was no bird song, which I always think is, you know, when you're walking in a wood and there's all the bird song just stops. So there was no bird song, and there was this really strange feeling, and I just suddenly felt really frightened, and I don't know why, and there's nothing scientific about this whatsoever. And I don't know what happened, but I became absolutely terrified, and I had to get out. I thought, I've got to get out of this wood. I don't like it. It's really frightening me. So I ran and ran and ran. I sort of had this pack on my back and these great big walking boots, and I must have looked like some sort of elephant charging through this empty, silent, sort of oddly, the air was oddly still and heavy, and it just didn't. It felt, it had a sort of deathly quality, which I can't really explain it in the way. But I ran out, and I was so relieved. I got to the road, and there was a car, and I just started waving and shouting, hello, hello, because I was so pleased to see some people and a car and a road. Anyway, so I walked back, and later that night I couldn't sleep, and I just suddenly remembered someone telling me about some atrocities in that particular locality. Someone I'd met a few days before, and she told me about a strange sect. There'd been a strange religious sect that had lived there and been persecuted. Anyway, I just suddenly remembered this. So I opened up my laptop, as you do, and I started Googling, and I worked out that exact tract of forest through which I had walked was exactly where this atrocity would have happened. So it was a particularly unpleasant account of persecution, where someone took it upon himself and his private army to wipe out an entire religious community who were living very peacefully. And in fact, they were very, very sort of modern, really. They allowed women to preach. This is back in the 15th century. So anyway, so it had happened in this wood. Through this wood, this track that I was on turned out to be a very, very ancient route, like a sort of a drover's route. And so I decided that it was haunted, as you do. So I thought, okay, this is ridiculous. I'm gonna go back and I'm gonna walk it. And I just made myself, because part of this whole journey for me was trying to trying to be a little to adopt some of the courage of these extraordinary women. So then I did go back and I did walk through it, and it felt absolutely fine. And so yeah, so that to get to the end of this story, I sort of, I felt as though I had not conquered something, but I had somehow learned to accommodate that fear within me, and I had just learned to sort of live with it. So I still felt frightened, but I just kept walking, and I got through the wood, and I was still alive, which is sort of life, really, isn't it?
It is.
And keep going.
It's a fabulous story, but it struck me reading it that it felt so raw and vulnerable that was there ever a question in your mind as to whether to include that story, or after the experience did you always think, well, this is going in the book?
No, I think I wanted it in there because because it was an important part of my own sort of journey of just learning to be slightly more rational about things, if you see what I mean.
Absolutely.
It's just very easy, and I think particularly the relationship, women and fear, we have a very, very complicated relationship. If you look at the studies, women are typically, we feel more fear, we are more frightened of more things, and we live with that all the time. And I was just really aware of this need to understand that fear, and then just to say, right, okay, I know you're there, but just step aside. You can be inside me, but please don't stop me. Don't stop me walking through a wood where I'm clearly perfectly safe.
I thought it was a wonderful thing to share, though, and I did wonder, would a male writer have included something that revealed this vulnerability about themselves? And maybe I'm reading too much into that. I do think male writing has changed because female writing has, and that more emotive and vulnerable way of writing, it connects so much deeper. And I think I do think male writers to some degree are picking up on that, but they are. It did make me question whether a male writer would have included that vulnerability. But it's so important, isn't it? It's such a visceral way of sharing that difference in the feeling of fear. You talked about it from being a mother and watching your kids on a cliff top path as well, didn't you? Yes.
Now I know that is particular to me because my husband doesn't seem to, he can watch them prancing around on the edge and he doesn't seem to worry, whereas I see them prancing around on the edge and I immediately imagine them. I can literally see them in my mind. I can see them falling over the edge. and he doesn't seem to do that. So I don't know if that's something to do with how vivid your imagination is, or something to do with how women are raised and how men are raised. So men typically, when they're raised, they are encouraged, and Simone de Beauvoir writes about this really eloquently in The Second Sex. They are encouraged, they are told, go and climb that tree, go and whatever it is, kick that ball, or go and throw yourselves over into that skateboard park, or whatever it is. Yeah, boys are encouraged to do that, whereas girls we're often told to keep our shoes clean, or keep our dress clean, or soon whatever it is. It's just these little tiny coded messages, and I think that's changing now. And I tried really hard to do it with my children, but I don't think I did it very well. I was still always telling the boy, saying different things to the boy as I was to the girls. So part of that is just, I think it's going to be quite a slow process, isn't it, as we sort of because we learn from our parents. And my brother was definitely raised differently to me and my sister.
Which philosopher's principles was he brought up to? But no, you're absolutely right, and I think it's fascinating, isn't it, that the way there's so much nurture wrapped around the nature that does mean things are different for the different sexes, and I think it's the same with, you know, it took you and your insight into the role of women to go looking for those stories of women who walked and seeking them out, and you noticed that no one else had told those stories, but few other people had noticed that. And I think we build up these layers of awareness now, don't we? And I do get the sense that things are changing. You know, we've always set out. I've always set out in Adventurous Inc. not to share those macho tales of conquest that are obsessed with the peak or distance or speed or time or any of those things. And I do think the genre has changed as a whole, but you must still come up against frustrating things. Like there was a reference to a review only fairly recently of Nan Shepherd's work, and still that sort of male view of how things should be does still persist in some quarters, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. It is changing though, and I think every time a woman or even a man writes about a woman, every time a woman writes about her walk or another woman, it just starts to add to that canon, and the canon really needs to change. So we really need to be, dragging all of these women with their little, or not so little, but with their guidebooks that they wrote 200 years ago. They need to be pulled back onto the stage and re-examined. I was amazed at how many. There were several things that struck me. I was amazed at how many women went for night walks, which is something now I do quite a lot. But I thought, I sort of grew up, and my mother grew up in the same way, thinking that, you don't go out at night. Night is not the time for walking. Night is the time you go inside, you close your curtains. It's very much about being sort of domestic, really. Particularly after your, you might have your clubbing years, but then you all settle down and you all stay in the evening. But why? Why stay in and watch television? Which is of course what we do, or whatever it is we do. But these women were all out walking because of course they didn't have television and they didn't have laptops and iPhones and radios. If they wanted entertainment, they would have to go out. So yes, I was very surprised at them all going out for these night walks. So that was the first thing that surprised me. And there was another thing that surprised me too, which is they're sleeping rough. So Simone de Beauvoir, regularly would sleep on a park bench, or she would sleep in a haystack. So I was just also surprised at that, because again, we're all told, aren't we, that you must have somewhere to stay. You can't just sleep on a park bench. And I think I've slept on a park bench once in my life, and I got pushed off the park bench. I was very young. And I was in a railway station over in Eastern Europe, and I was with a boyfriend actually, and we had nowhere to sleep. We were waiting for some train in the middle of the night, and we tried to sleep on a bench, and we were told by the police, no, you can't sleep on a bench. So that was my one experience, and I never really wanted to do it again. But yeah, Simone de Beauvoir was doing that quite regularly, without any sort of fretting and worrying about, I've got nowhere to stay, this is dreadful. She just would settle down with her. She carried her flask of red wine, and she'd have her red wine, and then she'd just go to sleep. But I think we now have grown up with so many just horrible stories. And I talk in the book about growing up with the Yorkshire Ripper in the background, and of course since then there's just been a constant stream of these rapes and murders, and that sort of lodges in your head. And I just don't think that Georgia O'Keeffe and Simone de Beauvoir and Nan Shepherd, I don't think they grew up on that sort of that media saturated with stories of rapes and murders. So whether there were more or less, I don't know, but they just didn't have that in the backs of their minds. They would just set off and have their night walks or sleep out on the hills.
It's
So that's something that's really changed.
And so we've almost swapped one set of constraints for another set of constraints that yet again tries to define the way that women are supposed to deport themselves and to go about. Peter, who is watching, has taken me to task in a direct message, but I'm going to share it with you all. He reminds me that Matt Gore, one of our other authors, did talk about the mistakes he made whilst night hiking. So I'm not tarring all men with the same brush, and I guess that was the point that I was trying to make, is that there are new thinkers coming onto the scene, and sharing a different way of going outdoors and reflecting and sharing on that.
Yes. He does wander around. He wanders around a lot at night, doesn't he? Well, he did for his last book, which I guess is what he talked to you about. And I read that book and I thought, oh God, I wish I could just wander around at night like that.
and you know, it was for me as a guy, it was really interesting to hear that perspective, because it made me realize the privilege that I've got in that I can go off and do that. And yeah, there's a little niggle at the back of your mind, and when you're out in the middle of the moors and you can hear someone coughing, even though you know it's a sheep, it sounds like a person, and
yes, it does.
It makes you worried. But it was important for me to hear that from you, that's your experience, and that made me realize what the nature of my experience was, really. So thank you for that. You've in lots of ways the book opened my eyes, and I guess that's what I'm looking to do. I really thought that the interesting bit, then you talked about it earlier on, though, was that in writing this book, you came to the realization that the book that you were writing and the experience that you were writing about, women walking away from something, was there in your own life, and that was as your role as a mother and a caregiver changed. I assume that's that.
Well, I have to tell you another funny story about that. So I was going to this sort of lot of emotional anguish, really, as I walked, and I suddenly realized what I was walking away from, which was this empty house with my children going, and I suddenly realized that why does no one write about it? I thought, well, no one really writes about the empty nest. No one really explores or sort of unpicks what's really happening there. So anyway, I was thinking about this and feeling quite emotionally, quite emotional about it all. But also sort of excited at the same time. And of course, I came back. The last walk I did was Georgia O'Keeffe's out in the desert. And I came back. And in fact, just before I got back, I got a taxi to go to the airport in New Mexico. And the taxi driver said to me, he said, oh, there's something kicking off in Wuhan. And I said, Woo, what? He said, oh, there's something coming from Wuhan, And I said, oh, I don't think we need to worry about that. Wuhan, that's just a place in China. We don't need to worry about that. And of course, 2 weeks later, we were in lockdown. So I had spent many of these last few months of walking, just sort of coming to terms with my empty house and rather looking forward to it by the end of that. And then, of course, they all came home. And our house was suddenly packed with the 4 kids all come home, with everything, all their university stuff. The whole house was just crammed with all their things. Everyone was trying to work in tiny spaces. Everyone was on their laptop all day, shouting into their seminars and lectures. And I just thought, oh my God, that empty nest that I'm so anguished about, it's just not going to happen. And they're all still here. So yeah, be careful what you wish for.
Absolutely. And do you think you've passed on that love of walking and the outdoors to them, or are they still in that rebellious phase where they're refusing to admit that actually it's quite a good thing to do?
No, I'm quite proud of myself, because they're all big hikers. So they all love it. So my eldest daughter, when she got to university, the first thing she did when she called me at the first weekend or whatever it was, she called me. I was, oh, Mom, can you send my hiking boots up? I've joined the society, the university hiking society, and I can't tell you what happened. I was just literally dancing around my kitchen. You're like, yes.
Well, and it's obviously it was obviously a good excuse for some family holidays as well. I love the way that you followed in the footsteps of Frida Lawrence and took the family along with you.
Dragged my children along, yeah.
I think that's brilliant, you know, and that's and I guess that's one of the reasons why I do this job, is that it's an excuse to get out there and enjoy what we enjoy doing and pretend that it's work. I mean, hey, how lucky are we?
Yeah, but do take your children with you, because they will hopefully turn into lifelong walkers. Yeah, no, I think it's really important, because the other thing I noticed with my kids and their friends is that children don't walk anymore. If they can help it, you know, they will cycle, they will catch a bus, but they really don't want to walk very much. And I noticed that children were being driven to school the whole time, and because that had never happened to me and I'd had to walk everywhere, I was quite determined that mine must walk too. And we didn't really do any sport or anything. It was walking or or that was it. So yes, I did make them all walk, and there was a lot of fussing at the beginning, but actually after a while they started to, I mean, just the things you see when you're out walking, the wildlife and, you know, the insects and extraordinary, just the things you come across. So I think so I'm really pleased. I forced them all to walk.
Well, you've got to pass it on, and it's not, you know, it's not just about the things that you see. It's about that opportunity to process things and work it through. I love the idea of sifting stuff out, and the big stuff gets left. I'll probably reflect on that on my next walk.
Oh well, please do. I'm sure you'll be able to improve on that metaphor. It needs a bit of work, I feel.
I doubt it. That's why I just read the books. And I share them with people. I don't try and improve on any metaphors. Well, Annabel, it's been absolutely wonderful. Thank you for this evening. Thank you for the book. I really loved it. I don't know if folk have had a chance to have a read yet, but if you have, it's well worth it. If there's folk joining us and they haven't had a copy because you're not on this subscription, sorry, I'm holding. We're on the hardback. We're on the hardback.
Oh, you're on the high. No, I was just going to say it's a paperback now. It's also it's changed to its original title. So it was originally, my title was originally Why Women Walk, and my editor. So I'm really spilling the beans here. My editor changed it to Walking in the Footsteps of Remarkable Women, which was fine. But I just felt I felt that wasn't the right title. So when it was paperback time, I said, please, can we have my original title? And she said yes.
I do prefer the cover on this one though, because they
oh.
I love the ladies on it.
Yeah, I do too.
One of them looks a bit like my granny, I have to say.
I have to say, do you know, I don't know who those women are. And one of the things I wanted to do, I've never got around to it, is I just wanted to have like a competition to try and find who there's somebody's grandmothers. All I know is that photograph was taken in about 1950, I think, about 1950 in Ireland.
Well, so if anyone knows
who those
ladies are,
those three intrepid walkers are. Yes.
If you want a copy and you've not had one in your subscription, do drop me an email. The books always go in the back issues eventually, but if you want one sooner than that, drop me an email, and I'm sure I can help you out. Annabel, it's been fab. We've even talked about next books. I think there's more books to come. So thank you so much. You've opened my eyes to lots of things. My privilege, the context of these women, it's been fabulous. So thank you so much, and thank you for holding the fort this evening when I disappeared. In the end, I've had to do this all streaming off my phone, because my home internet wouldn't actually work well enough. So there we go.
Gosh, well done you.
Technology, brilliant. I'm gonna take us off pen, and then we can all do the wavy goodbye thing.
Thank you.
See you all later. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope you've enjoyed it. I certainly have.
Thank you so much. Yes.
Bye, everyone.
Cheerio.
Bye. Thank you.